Samantha Shannon joins us on today's Fully Booked Chats. We will discuss fantasy, writing, and her new novel, A Day of Fallen Night. This discussion is moderated by Kat Aquino, Filipino author of the upcoming young adult manga Champion of the Rose. Samantha Shannon is the New York Times and the Sunday Times best-selling author of the Bone Season series. Her work has been translated into 26 languages. Her fourth novel, The Priory of the Orange Tree, was her first outside of the Bone Season series and was a New York Times bestseller. She lives in London. Kat Aquino is an award-winning Manila-born author, teacher, and Erasmus Mundus children's literature, media, and culture master's student. She is also currently based in London. Champion of the Rose, her anti-imperialist, Spanish colonial, history-inspired, queer, YA fantasy graphic novel slash manga series, co-created with Dominique Duran, launches 2024 with VIZ Media. She can be found at katakino.net. Let's welcome the amazing Samantha and Kat.
Hi, everyone. Hello, Fully Booked, and hello, readers. So, Samantha, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed. This is such a huge joy for me because I read Priory in 2020 in the lockdown. It was one of the many fantasy books that I fully immersed myself in. And I still think about Tane, Sabran, Eid until this day. And reading A Day of Fallen Night has been such a joy as well. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm so thrilled that you enjoyed both of them, and I'm really excited to be here.
That's so great. So we have a few questions that we'd like to ask you. We have a first warm-up question. Can you tell us where you're calling from and what are you reading at the moment?
I am calling from Singapore, which I'm really excited about. I've never been to Singapore before, so I'm currently in a little booth in a cafe in Singapore. I absolutely love it here. And I am currently reading a book called The Prison Healer by Lynette Noni, who is an Australian author. I just did a panel with her during my Australian tour, and I'm really enjoying it so far. It's a YA that's set entirely inside a prison, which I thought was a really interesting concept.
That is really interesting. I don't know a lot about YAs set in prisons, so it's cool that those exist. And so it sounds like you're doing a book tour in Asia and Australia as well.
Yes, so A Day of Fallen Night came out at the end of February. So I've done a UK tour, US tour with one stop in Canada. Then I've been to Australia. Then I'm just in Singapore. Then I'm going home for about a week, and then I'm going to Croatia. So it's been a really busy few weeks.
It does sound really busy, an actual global book tour. Congratulations, but also I hope you can get lots of rest, and I hope it's a good time for you.
Thank you so much. I mean, I absolutely love traveling. It's such a huge privilege of the career, and it's been wonderful. So I'm just hoping I can recover from the jet lag when I'm home, because the UK Australia difference is so big. But it's been really, really fun. I've loved it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for updating us on where you are. And I think the next questions that we'll ask will be about the books themselves, if that's all right. So first up, we'll ask about the first book of the Roots of Chaos series that was published, even though it is kind of second to A Day of Fallen Night, about Priory of the Orange Tree. It's a retelling of the legend of St. George. We're curious to ask, what compelled you to use that story as a jumping off point? Why this legend specifically? And why did you decide to incorporate feminist and queer themes into the story?
Well, I grew up with the legend of St. George. I was raised in the Church of England. I went to Girl Guides, and St. George would often crop up in my life as this figure of heroism. And I was always a bit frustrated when I was young because, I'm sure most people are at least vaguely familiar with the St. George legend, but the basic thing that happens is that St. George comes across a city or a town that's being terrorized by a dragon. He rescues the beautiful princess from it. He kills the dragon. He marries her, and they live happily ever after. I was always frustrated because I wanted to know more about the princess from that legend. I wanted to know who she was, which country the battle was being fought in, what was her relationship like with her father. Like, those kinds of questions just always occurred to me when I was younger. And I decided, I had a small gap in my Bone Season series. When I wrote the third book, The Song Rising, I had quite a lot of trouble with it for various reasons. It just wasn't a particularly easy book for me, and it ended up being with my editor for a really long time. So I decided to use that opportunity to work on a book about St. George and the Dragon. And I started researching the various versions of the legend, and the very earliest version I could find straight away set off alarm bells, because when George, he basically arrives in this city called Lacia, and again, it's being terrorized by a dragon. The leader of the city has organized a lottery of lives. So he sacrifices all of the livestock to the dragon, and when there is no livestock left, he starts sacrificing his people. And in order to appease the people, he puts his own daughter's name into the lottery. And one day her name is drawn. St. George happens to be riding past on that day, and he sees the beautiful princess, and he says to the leader of the city, he says, "I will kill the dragon, but only if you convert to Christianity first." And that was something that had been missing from the version of the legends I had heard, because it doesn't reflect particularly well on St. George. I was thinking, well, what if they didn't want to convert to Christianity? I think in the original story, they worshipped the Greek gods. And so it's very much, it had this element of Christianity triumphing over paganism that I hadn't quite anticipated. And again, it left me with questions about George, so I started to delve a bit further into the story. And there were certain details that I had found out about the legend. So, for example, that St. George's sword or his lance sometimes has the traditional name Ascalon. And I started asking myself, well, who named it Ascalon? Who came up with these details? And I traced that to a story that was published in the 16th century, and it was called The Renowned History of the Seven Champions of Christendom by Richard Johnson. And this guy was the first one who portrayed St. George as being English, and he seems to have invented quite a lot of these details, like the sword being called Ascalon. In his version of the story, St. George is possibly even more of a problematic character. So in this version, he rides to Egypt, whereupon, again, the dragon appears and has been tormenting the people. And straight away, the princess Sabra falls in love with George, and she says, I will follow you as a pilgrim through the wide world. I will forsake, my false religion, my crown, everything to follow you. And that was already quite frustrating. And basically, this version of the story just added more and more details to St. George that I found really quite horrifying. He's very much this. He hates anyone who isn't a white Christian man, essentially. And it really frustrated me that this man who really in this story was associated with intolerance and cruelty and brutality had ended up being this figure of tolerance and goodness by the time I encountered him. So I really wanted to deconstruct and challenge this story, particularly Johnson's version of St. George. So that's almost why I wanted to make it, a queer, female-focused, diverse story, because it felt like it was challenging all the things that Johnson cared about, and it would have been an unsuccessful retelling if I hadn't made it that way.
Thank you very much for sharing that. You mentioned at the very start that you were unhappy with the legend when you used to hear it, and then the more you learned, the more problematic things that you uncovered. And I think it's amazing how you were able to do that in Priory, because the little details with Ascalon, the little details with the knights corresponding to the actual myths that you were able to research, I think that is incredible fantasy work. So congratulations. So the next question is about A Day of Fallen Night as a prequel to Priory. What made you decide to revisit the world of Priory and explore a different time period in this universe?
Well, when I was writing The Priory of the Orange Tree, one of the the main things that happens in the history of the world is the defeat of this fire-breathing dragon called the Nameless One. And that meant that in order to fill the gap between that event and the modern day, I had to think of several centuries of history. And because the Nameless One was defeated relatively quickly after his arrival in the world, I thought it would be vital for there to have been a period of history when a lot of fire-breathing dragons attack the world to show the stakes of what happens when the magic system in this world becomes unbalanced. So I created this period called the Grief of Ages, or the Great Sorrow, which was when a huge, essentially, five fire-breathing dragons emerged from a volcano called the Dreadmount. They created various creatures out of the wildlife of the world, and they just began this reign of destruction that went on for a couple of years. And there was a plague during that period. It was essentially the worst time to be alive in the world of the Roots of Chaos. So the more I wrote about that, and the more its shadow stretched over the Priory of the Orange Tree. Quite a lot of people from that period of history were important in legends that are being told in Priory, particularly the story of Glorian Shieldheart, the great Queen of Innis. I was fascinated by, well, what if we take that period that so many stories have been told about it, and I tell the real story? And I knew it was going to be a bit of a challenge, because the Grief of Ages was ended by the arrival of a comet called the Long-Haired Star. And that was a bit of a narrative dilemma, because with the Priory of the Orange Tree, the way the characters defeat the dragon is fairly classic. They gather various items, go on a quest, put the items together, and they defeat the enemy. It was intentionally meant to be quite a classic fantasy story in that way. With the Day of Fallen Night, I knew that wasn't going to be possible, because the enemy is so huge. The human armies cannot defeat the armies of the Dreadmount. It just didn't seem feasible for that to happen. And they can't bring the comet any faster. It just wouldn't have made sense. So I knew that it was going to be a bit of an awkward challenge because of that. It might seem as if the comet was a deus ex machina, just drops out of nowhere and solves all of the characters' problems. So I decided I really wanted to do it because of that challenge. I've always liked pushing myself to grow as an author. And I thought, well, what if this story is less of a traditional defeating the enemy kind of narrative, but it's more about outlasting the enemy. It's a story about survival and endurance. And that ended up being very much what it was about. And I also found that because the enemy is so huge and so insurmountable, I ended up doing a lot of focusing on the characters' personal lives and sharpening their personal issues and making those a source of conflict rather than the conflict that's going on in the background. So yeah, I suppose I was drawn to it firstly because I wanted to expand the world of Priory. I had built this huge world and I wanted to return to it and explore more countries. I wanted the challenge of also rebuilding the same world during a different time period, because I'd done all of that world building. But I essentially had to start again because it's been several centuries. There's a gap of several centuries. So yeah, I suppose I was drawn to it because it was a challenge and because it just seemed like a really intriguing period of history.
Thank you for talking about the specific technicalities and challenges of the world building and the writing that have to go into it. Our next question is kind of related to that as well, in that it's also a craft writing question. How do you write fantasy in Priory and A Day of Fallen Night to speak to readers on contemporary issues like feminism, for example? Because I'm sure one of the biggest misconceptions or stereotypes about history, I think, is that they had very different politics from us. But you're writing about female-centered narratives, many things that speak to our more contemporary mindsets. So how did you use fantasy to do that?
Yeah, it ended up being a bit even more contemporary than I fully expected. So there were things I wrote about in A Day of Fallen Night that reflected the real world in ways I just couldn't have predicted when I started writing it. So the obvious one being COVID was very comparable to the plague in the book. And then in terms of feminist issues, there was Roe versus Wade in the US. I obviously knew that had come under prolonged attack for many years, but I didn't expect it to be overturned before A Day of Fallen Night was published. So that was very unexpected. But I do, it's a difficult issue when you want to talk about real world challenges in fantasy, and I think it can be a really great way to do it because there is a sense of distance. It's difficult as an author to talk about issues without seeming preachy or like you're trying to tell the reader what to think. Fantasy, I think, provides a good mirror for exploring issues without necessarily directly talking about them. You can dance around the subject, you can put your own thoughts into it without making it feel like there is a particular message that you want the reader to take from it. And of course, you often are putting messages into it, you're putting your own personal perspective into it. But I just think fantasy provides that little layer of distance that allows you to almost do that more effectively. And again, you don't know what personal experiences a reader is bringing to the book. You don't know. It's difficult to talk about subjects without seeming didactic a lot of the time.
Absolutely, but totally agree that fantasy gives us the tools and the opportunities to be able to explore all of these. And to continue about questions about your writing process, what kind of research did you do for Priory and A Day of Fallen Night? Did you rely heavily on the research to inform your decisions on the world building?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of research. So it really, obviously I did a lot of research on the legend of St. George. That was one of the earliest aspects of the book I researched because it was the inspiration behind it. And the more research I did, the more it generated elements of the world building. So for example, when I was looking at the text I mentioned by Richard Johnson, because I wanted to challenge his version of St. George specifically, I ended up taking quite a few details that he put into the story and integrated that into the magic system. So when St. George fights the dragon in Johnson's story, he does so underneath an enchanted orange tree. And the orange tree protects him from the dragon's fire. So that was the inspiration for one aspect of the magic system. I thought, okay, well, why would an orange tree protect a man from dragon fire? And I thought, okay, well, why don't the roots of the tree go deep into the ground, draw up fire from the core of the world, and that could somehow repel the dragon's fire? So a lot of the research into that legend was just naturally producing the world building in some ways. Then I had to decide what kind of world I wanted to set the story in. So I had the magic system, but I had to think about what the countries, the kingdoms and queendoms, what they looked like. And I did toy with the idea for a while of setting it in the real world, in a sort of unspecified period of history. I eventually decided not to do that because I just wanted it to feel more high fantasy. I thought that it was going to be perhaps too much of an undertaking to set it in the real world. I didn't think I was quite prepared for that level of intense historical research I would have to do. And of course, if you're writing historical fiction, you need to be necessarily much more faithful to the exact details of history. Something I love about fantasy is that you can engage with history in history without necessarily taking every single aspect of it into the story. So that's what I decided to do. So I did a lot of research into myths and legends, and especially related to dragons. I wanted to capture the huge variety of different legends about dragons that are in the world, down to sort of specific subtypes like wyverns, for example. There was a lot of that, a lot of reading medieval bestiaries and that sort of thing. And then there was each of the countries in the book is loosely based on a real country. So I did a lot of reading around, clothing and history and culture from those countries, and had to think about the best way to integrate that into a fantastical world. So yes, a lot of reading was done, and I had to stop myself going down too many research rabbit holes a lot of the time. So I remember once I was desperately trying to find out what material a hat might have been made from in a certain period of history at a certain time in a certain place. And it took me 3 days just to find that out. And it amounted to maybe a sentence in the book, but I was very proud of that detail.
I think that is a research undertaking.
Yeah,
An absolute task.
Yeah, but it was fun. I enjoy research. Another thing that took a lot of research was the naming system of the books. I'm fascinated by etymology, and I really wanted the naming and place system to be meaningful in some way. I didn't just want to pull names out of thin air, which I think is quite hard in fantasy. It's actually quite difficult to create fantasy names that sound realistic in a way. So I studied Old and Middle English while I was at university, and I was really intrigued by how Old English is so different to modern English. If you put Old English in front of a modern English speaker, it's completely incomprehensible. So I decided that in order to create the names in the book, I would use older forms of existing languages along with some extinct languages like Gothic, for example. And it's an element of the world building I absolutely love. It's very fiddly and it takes me a long time, but I just really enjoy playing with language. So I have this huge etymology document that details exactly where every name came from, what language it's from, and what it means. So that's something that takes a lot of research as well.
That is incredible. So much research just went into the bedrock of the series, but it's great that you had the freedom to kind of play around with it and not be completely strictly accurate.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question is about what might have inspired you, but specifically, can you tell us about stories that you might have read in your formative years besides The Legend of St. George that might have influenced the Roots of Chaos and your writing?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. Roots of Chaos was mostly inspired by myths and legends rather than specific kind of more modern stories. I suppose I'm loosely inspired by Tolkien in terms of how much thought he put into the language of his books. I'm certainly not a linguist to the same degree that he was. He was actually creating his own languages, but that intense focus he had on language was definitely inspiring to me to try to emulate that to some extent in my own books. Generally formative fiction outside the Roots of Chaos. Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale was a really formative book for me that introduced me to dystopian fiction and also really to feminism as a concept. Like, I hadn't really thought deeply about my place in the world as a woman before I read The Handmaid's Tale, and so that was a really important novel for me. Another one was Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman, which was another early dystopian novel I read, and my first series, The Bone Season, is dystopian. And I think that reading those books like The Handmaid's Tale, like Noughts and Crosses, was what led me into that genre. I was just fascinated by how the dystopian genre kind of pushes characters to the extreme. They're always in quite extreme situations, and how the pressure cooker of that genre allows you to unfold the character because they're in just situations that they might not be in another genre. Yeah, there's so many, really. I'd say Garth Nix's Sabriel was another really important book to me in terms of just seeing women in fantasy doing great things and leading the story. Sabriel was, I hadn't read fantasy for a while before I read Sabriel because I'd been a bit disheartened by how little female-driven fantasy I could find, and it did seem to be very much a man's genre at that point in my life. And then when I discovered Sabriel, I saw that there could be amazing fantasy stories driven by women. So I'm very grateful to Garth Nix for that.
It's amazing how stories can inspire us even years after we pick them up. And that leads us to the next question, which is related to the first writing that you might have done. You wrote your first novel, which remains unpublished, at the age of 18. And Fully Book wants to ask elements of that novel, as you said in an interview, helped you write The Bone Season as well. And it debuted when you were only in your 20s. So you've been prolific for a very long time. Do you still feel that same sort of pressures or expectations at the start of your career, now that you are a more experienced author?
Oh no, I really don't actually. I had a a very strange debut experience. So yes, I started Aurora, the unpublished novel, when I was 15, and I finished it when I was sort of 17 or 18. I can't remember specifically. And indeed, like you say, I did use some elements of it in the Bone season. But my debut launch was very, very high pressure because basically a lot of people were interested in me as an author before my book was out in the world because I was so young. So I was 20 when I signed with Bloomsbury in the UK. And that meant that, nobody had read the Bone season, but it was, I was being called the next J.K. Rowling. I was, under this huge pressure to be something I knew I wasn't. It was to be compared to an author who has been that successful was just really it was setting me up for failure from the beginning. And I was so acutely aware of that the entire time. So it was a lot of pressure, and it did have a pretty bad effect on my mental health for a few years. But yeah, I feel much better now because I feel like I've been able to establish myself as Samantha Shannon rather than, the next J.K. Rowling or the female George R.R. Martin or whatever else I was being called at the time. And I feel like I've managed to establish much more of a personal identity for myself now that I've got a few books under my belt. But it was an interesting kind of double-edged sword, that period. Like, I'm aware that I was very lucky to have that much attention when I was a debut. It's not something that always happens, and it's probably the reason that I was a New York Times bestseller immediately. So I do, I was lucky in that sense, but from a mental health perspective, it was very difficult.
I'm so sorry that you had to go through that. I think that's true. Most people wouldn't expect that debuting with that amount of attention would be a double-edged sword, as you said. But I'm very glad that things have changed, but also that you were able to make your name for yourself and not on the expectations of other people. I think that is so important, especially as a creator. So in line with that, our last question for the interview section is, do you have any tips or advice that you would like to impart to debuting authors? The interview guide also has a little parenthesis that says context. Kat is a debuting author. So if you'd like, you can tell me or you can tell someone else.
Absolutely, yeah, and congratulations on your debut. It sounds amazing.
Thank you.
In terms of advice, so my advice sounds a bit silly, but it's actually don't take too much advice. And the reason I say that is because I feel like there is a lot of very prescriptive writing advice out there. So I've seen people say things like, you have to write 1,000 words a day to be an author. You have to write every day to be an author. I know from personal experience that that's not true. I have chronic illnesses that mean that I can't write every day. And, if you're, I don't know, say that you were a single parent with 3 kids, you're not going to be able to write 1,000 words a day, or it's you might not be able to every single day of your life. And that doesn't make you any less of an author. I just think that there is a lot of advice that acts as if there is just one single way, one formula to being a great author. And there just isn't. I would take advice very much as guidelines rather than a rule book. If there's a piece of advice that makes you feel bad about yourself and like you're not a real writer, it's probably just not advice that's tailored for you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take that to heart. And so that ends the interview section. Thank you, Samantha. We'll now move on to the fan questions. So we have 2 readers who have recorded videos of themselves, and we're going to play the first one, which is from Isa Soriano, up next.
Hi, I'm Isa, and my question is, what was an early experience when you learned that language had power?
That's such a great question. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think, funny enough, it was a situation with my dad. So my dad and I were raised in different parts of the UK. I was born in London. My dad was born in Manchester. And I won't say it, but I said a particular swear word in my dad's presence when I was a kid. And in London, it's a fairly soft swear word. Like, it really is not that offensive at all. However, in the north, where my dad is from, it's considered extremely offensive. And I had no idea of this when I said it when I was a kid. And my dad's reaction was so shocking to me. Like, he took me to one side and he told me I should never say that word again. And it was a word that I heard my southern mum use all the time. So I think that was a moment when I realized that language does have power, and that also your personal upbringing and experience, the same word could have such incredibly different reactions from two different people. So I'd say that was probably my earliest memory of something related to language in that way. And then when I got to university, one of the first lessons I learned was about why swear words we have in the UK are considered profane words. And the professor basically talked us through how it was related to the Norman conquest, and how some of the words that are considered very rude in the UK were actually just the standard words that were used for certain body parts by the English population. But after the Normans invaded, the French words were considered to be the more, dignified versions of those words. So the original ones became profane. And I just thought that was really, really interesting. And it's probably what kicked off my interest in etymology.
I love that it started with the swear words, and then you get to uni and there's an academic real answer for your question.
I know, yeah. So it's all of my language experiences are related to swearing.
That's a great education right there. Thank you. The next question is from VIZ Media, and it's about mythical creatures.
Hi, I'm Bea Sevilla, and my question for Ms. Shannon is, what mythical creature would you hope to be with, and what creature would you hope not to be with if you were stuck on a deserted island? Thank you so much.
Oh, hard one. I suppose the answer to both is dragon, in a way, because it depends on the dragon's temperament. There's so many different kinds of dragon. I would love a calm dragon to be my general companion, but then the kind of fire-breathing dragons I write about in the Priory of the Orange Tree, I definitely would not want with me on a deserted island. There is also an animal companion that I saw for the Priory of the Orange Tree that it's loosely modelled on a creature from medieval bestiaries, but it's called an ichneumon. And I think it was probably inspired by the relationship between mongooses and snakes. Mongooses will fight snakes, they're very good at it, to the point that they've built up a resistance to snake venom a lot of the time. And I think that's what inspired this idea of this mongoose-like creature, the ichneumon, as the enemy of the dragon. To me, it was a bit silly to have a mongoose-sized creature fighting the dragons in the Priory of the Orange Tree, so I just made it essentially a massive talking mongoose, and I absolutely love them, and I would really like one of those on a deserted island with me.
Great. So you would take the ichneumon and you would not have the Roots of Chaos dragons on a deserted island. I think that's very fair.
Yeah, bad idea.
Bad idea. Okay, and now we have the last section. It's the fast talk section. So this is going to be kind of a lightning game round portion. Please try to answer these questions as quickly as you can. They're just blank questions, so hopefully it will be fun. Okay, so the first question, there are 5 of them. The first one is, do you prefer writing in the daytime or writing at night?
Ideally day, but usually night.
Okay, and then reading with music or in silence?
In silence.
Next, happy endings or sad endings?
I'm going to cheat and say bittersweet endings.
In the middle, okay. And 3 books that you always recommend?
The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid, The 5th Season by N.K. Jemisin, and The Jasmine Throne by Tasha Siri.
Okay, and the last one, 3 words that you would use to describe a day of falling night?
Epic, sapphic, and sad.
That's pretty much on point with what I've read so far. So thank you. That's the Fast Talk section closed right there. Thank you. So thank you very much for answering all our many, many questions. There was so much to talk about in this little event. And we hope that the readers, everyone watching this, had a good time. Please don't forget to grab a copy of A Day of Fallen Night and Samantha's other novels from fullybookedonline.com. Remember to stay safe and keep on reading.